Welcome everyone, this is Jennyfer Solamo and welcome back to this video lesson. And today we are going to discuss Chapter 7, Unit 2, Contact between European and Indigenous Australian. For this video, we are going to discuss the Part 1 of this lesson, which is Cooperation. You can find this lesson on your book on pages 279 to 282.
And at the end of this lesson, you will be able to examine the two perspectives on the colonization and extension of settlement in Australia, assess the impact of disease on Australia's Indigenous people, and lastly, list examples of cooperation between European and Indigenous people in the early years of the colony. But before we start with our new lesson, let's have a short review of our previous lesson, the extension of Australian colonial settlements. Okay, now let's start with our review. Let's remember the 6 British colonies. Let's start with number 1. Number 1 is New South Wales, and the capital city, Sydney. Okay, number 2 is Tasmania, and the capital city is Hobart. And number 3 is Victoria, and the capital city is Melbourne. How about number 4? Number 4 is Western Australia, and the capital city is Perth. Number 5 is South Australia, and the capital city, Adelaide. And lastly, we have Queensland with the capital city of Brisbane. Okay, now for this activity, I want you to write the British colony being described in each number. I'll give you 1 minute, but if you need more time, you can pause the video for a while and check your answer when you are ready. So, time starts now. Okay, now let's check your answer. For number 1, it's the first British colony in Australia. What's that? Okay, that's New South Wales. Okay, let's move on to number 2. David Collins led an expedition to establish a penal colony on the Derwent River, and Hobart Town was surveyed as the capital of this new settlement. The correct answer is Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land. Okay, number 3. This colony started in 1829 with James Stirling as the first governor. The progress in this colony was very slow during the first 20 years. The answer is Western Australia, or Swan River Colony. Okay, now let's have number 4. The demand for fertile land to graze sheep led to the establishment of this settlement by John Badman. It was a free settlement. That means no convicts were ever sent there. So the correct answer is Victoria, or Port Phillip District. And number 5, it's another free settler colony which started in 1836, and it was privately funded and carefully planned on the ideas of Edward Gibbon Wakefield. The correct answer is, that's South Australia. And number 6, it was explored by John Oxley and was used to be part of New South Wales, but became a separate colony in December 1859. The correct answer is Okay, Queensland. And for number 7, secondary settlements for dangerous convicts includes areas in Port Arthur in Tasmania, Moreton Bay, and Norfolk Island. And last, for number 8, in February 1851, what started in Australia after the discovery of payable gold in New South Wales? The correct answer is gold rush. Okay, good job. Okay, remember in our previous lesson, who occupied Australia long before the arrival of the European? Well, the Aboriginals or indigenous people. And when we say indigenous people, they are the first people living in a country. So in Australia, there were hundreds of different or diverse Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes. Now, in 1770s, British arrived and colonized their land. Britain transported their convicts there, and later, thousands of free settlers from England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales migrated to Australia. Now, what do you think will happen if these two different cultures come into contact? So now our lesson is contact between European and Indigenous Australians. But in this lesson, we are going to focus on the positive side, which is evidence of cooperation and friendship between Europeans and the Aboriginals. Now let's take a look at this image. These two men look like arguing. But who do you think is right? The man on the left side or the man on the right side? Well, both of them are actually right. We look or interpret things based on what we see. We have different opinions or ideas or understanding based on whatever situation we are in, and we call it perspective. We have different perspectives or points of view. Now, let's study the two different perspectives or points of view on the colonization and extension of settlement in Australia. So, for the Europeans, Australia was settled peacefully. So that means there's no violence, no shedding of blood. But for Indigenous people, that's the opposite. For them, Australia was invaded, and if they resisted or fought back, there would be violence. Okay? Next, for the Europeans, the land was explored and occupied. During that time, Europeans explore and claim lands that they discover. Europeans are like this. I found this land, so this is mine, and I can use it whenever I want. But for indigenous people, that's the opposite. That's their land, and their land was stolen. They were dispossessed from their country. That means their land, which had historical and spiritual importance to them, were taken away from them. For the European, they developed farms and set up towns, people accumulated wealth, and progress was made. But for the Aboriginals, they were killed by disease and their culture was disregarded. So Europeans brought diseases which caused death of thousands of people. And Europeans did not respect the Aboriginals' culture and beliefs. And unfortunately, which perspective was taught in schools in Australia until the late 20th century? That's the European perspective. So that means Aboriginals' perspective was hidden for a long time. But the good thing is, at present, Indigenous history is now part of national story. So, those are the two different perspectives on the colonization of Australia. How about the outcome of the contact? Evidence shows that both cooperation and conflict occurred or took place when Indigenous Australians and the British colonists came into contact. And again, in this video, we will focus on the bright side, which is cooperation between the two cultures. So, cooperation and friendship took place between Indigenous Australians and British colonists. But how? It's the same thing with any relationship, in your family, in your friends, and even classmates. One of the factors why we have good relationship is respect. We need each other's respect, because without that, you won't have a healthy relationship and you won't expect them to cooperate with you. So in Australia, when Aboriginal people, their country, culture, and freedom were respected, cooperation was evident. Okay, so these are some examples of cooperation between European and Indigenous people in the early years of the colony. First, use of European resources. So Aboriginal people learned to use European resources such as steel, axes, pieces of iron, horseshoes, and others. So they used them to improve the effectiveness of their weapon and tools. And secondly, when they didn't have enough food to eat, they learned to eat European foods such as flour and sugar. And next, the employment of Aboriginal people. So British employed Aboriginals wherever they settled. They hired Aboriginals as houseboys, domestic servants, gardeners, and others, which means Aboriginals could remain in their country and receive support from members of their extended family. So it's a win-win for both sides. And one more thing, one very common form of cooperation was used by explorers and the police of Aboriginal trackers. Well, Aboriginal trackers are very important to the British colonists because they were the ones who helped or guided the British in exploring the Australian landscape. Okay, so now let's have the source to be from your book. So Western Australian colonist George Fletcher Moore wrote about the Aboriginal labor. You can pause this video to read it for yourself. So now, what can you learn about Aboriginal labor from this source? Well, George Fletcher Moore emphasized the importance of Aboriginal labor, that without them, they would experience a very serious shortage of labor. Okay, now let's take a look at our second source. According to Tony Austin, pastoralists in Northern Australia desperately needed Aboriginal labor. Okay, but before that, what is pastoralist? Pastoralist means sheep or cattle farmer. Now, why did they desperately need Aboriginal stockmen or Aboriginal labor? Well, according to our source, it's because Aboriginal stockmen possess horsemanship, that is a capacity for long hours in unrelenting heat, and they had unmatched knowledge of bushcraft and the land. Now let's have source 2D. So this shows a good bond or friendship between Alexander Colley, the resident magistrate at King George Sound, and an Aboriginal man from the southwest corner of Australia named Mukare. Now Mukare and his brother were Colley's informants for his essay. And Mukare usually stayed at Colley's house whenever he visited Albany settlement. And he was also known for being a peacemaker and effective mediator between black and white communities. That's why he is known as a man of peace. And when Alexander Colley was dying, he asked to be buried alongside Mukare. So we could really say that they have a good friendship or good relationship. Okay, third, recognition of Aboriginal land ownership. So they believed that the land of Australia was a terra nullius, or land belonging to no one, shaped the attitudes of the early European settlers and remained a foundation of Australian property ownership into the 20th century. What this attitude overlooked was that Indigenous Australians had a close or intimate relationship with the land, but John Batman was an exception. He recognized the Aboriginal land ownership. So, he organized a treaty with the locals in June 1835 to buy land in the Port Phillip Bay area or in Victoria. So, that was known as Batman's Treaty. And Aboriginal people were to be paid with blankets, knives, shirts, and food for over many years. But sadly, Batman's Treaty was declared illegal. as all land in Australia belonged to the Crown. Now let's talk about the impact of disease on the Aboriginals. But first, can you name these diseases? Okay, let's have the first one. That's very common. Okay, so that's cold. We usually have that. Okay, next. What if you have headache, fever, runny nose, cough, body ache, and others? So what do you think? What disease is that? Okay, that's influenza. And how about this one? Cough with blood, you have chest pain, you lost weight, and coughing. So those are the symptoms of this disease. Okay, we call it tuberculosis. And the last one, I know you don't want to see that. Okay, that's kind of gross, but okay, we call it smallpox. Okay, now, when European settlers first arrived, Australian Aboriginals had very limited immunity to a range of diseases, including smallpox and tuberculosis. Even common cold and influenza are believed to have been potentially fatal or deadly for the Aboriginals. And in fact, in 1789, the smallpox epidemic was believed to have killed about half of the Aboriginal population in the area of modern-day Sydney. So that's it. Okay, now let's move on to our first activity. Okay, for this activity, you are going to fill in the missing word. Okay, you have 1 minute to do this. Time starts now. Okay, now let's check your answer. So, let's start with the European perspective. So, for Europeans, Australia was settled peacefully. And for the indigenous perspective, Australia was invaded and resistance was met with violence. Okay, next, number 2. The land was explored and occupied, but for the Aboriginals, their land was stolen and Aboriginal people were dispossessed from their country. Okay, next, number 3. Farms were developed and towns were established and people accumulated wealth and progress was made. But on the other hand, they were killed by diseases and their culture was disregarded. Okay, now you have completed a table. Good job! And now, which perspective was taught in schools and generally accepted by Australians until the late 20th century? The answer is, okay, the European perspective. Well done! Okay, now let's proceed to our second activity, which is questions and answers. I'll be giving you 30 seconds to answer these 2 questions. Are you ready? Time starts now. Okay, now let's check your answer. For number 1, what epidemic was believed to have killed about half of the original population in the area of modern Sydney? So is it A, tuberculosis, B, smallpox, C, influenza, or D, measles? And the correct answer is smallpox. Okay, good. Next, number 2. What made the Aboriginal people vulnerable to diseases brought by the European settlers? Is it A, B, C, or D? Well, the correct answer is letter A. They had a very limited immunity to a range of diseases. Okay, let's continue. So for number 3 and 4, your time starts now. Okay, let's check your answer. So how did cooperation or friendship develop between the British colonies and the Aboriginal people? And the correct answer is, of course, it's letter A. When the Aboriginal people, their country, culture, and freedom were respected. Okay, number 4. Which one was not an example of cooperation between the British settlers and the Aboriginals? The correct answer is letter D. For number 5 and 6, your time starts now. Now, let's check your answer. Why did the Aboriginal people use European resources such as steel axes and pieces of iron? The correct answer is letter C. To improve the effectiveness of their weapons and tools. Okay, number 6. So why was Aboriginal labor important to British pastoral lands in Northern Australia? And the correct answer is, well, it's all of the above. For the last pair, number 7 and number 8, your time starts now. Okay, so let's check. Black refers to the British government in the name of the monarch of Great Britain. So the correct answer is, okay, letter B, crown. Okay, next. What belief shaped the attitudes of the early European settlers and remained a foundation of Australian property ownership into the 20th century? Correct answer is letter C, terra nullius, or land belonging to no one. Brilliant! Now let's have our last activity, which is also the summary of our lesson. I'll be giving you 2 minutes to finish everything. Are you ready? Time starts now. Now let's check your answers. Okay, let's have the first one. There were two distinct points of views or perspectives on the colonization and extension of settlement in Australia. So first, the European believed that Australia was settled peacefully, the land was explored and occupied, farms were developed, towns were established, people accumulated wealth, and progress was made. But for the indigenous people, Australia was invaded, resistance was met with violence, and land was stolen. Aboriginal people were dispossessed from their country, and they were killed by disease, and their culture was disregarded. However, evidence shows that both cooperation and conflict occurred when Indigenous Australians and the British colonies came into contact. Okay, next, impact of disease. So Australian Aboriginals had a very limited immunity to a range of diseases, including smallpox and tuberculosis. Even common colds and influenza are believed to have been potentially fatal or deadly for Aboriginals. In 1789, smallpox epidemic is believed to have killed about half of the Aboriginal population in the area of modern Sydney. Okay, now let's have the last one, cooperation and friendship. So cooperation was evident when Aboriginal people, their country, culture, and freedom were respected. Good. And the use of European resources. Aboriginal people used European resources to improve the effectiveness of their weapons and tools. And blank of Aboriginal people. That means Aboriginal were employed as houseboys, domestic servants, gardeners, and other. What's the answer? Employment of Aboriginal people. And in return, they received support for members of their extended family. Third one, recognition of Aboriginal land ownership. So example of that is Batman's Treaty. So John Batman organized a treaty with local Wurundjeri elders to buy land in the Port Phillip Bay area in 1835. And also we had a story of friendship between Alexander Coley and Mokare. All done, everyone. Now let's move on to our self-assessment section. So you're going to check by yourself whether you understand the lesson or not, or whether you have met your goals. So these are our unit goals. Okay, let's say for example, I can examine two perspectives on the colonization and extension of settlement in Australia. If you can do it, then put a tick. Now, let's have the second one. I can assess the impact of disease on Australia's Indigenous people. Now, if you have question or you don't understand, put X and try to review the lesson again. Now, do it. Now, this is our question for this week.
Bye everyone! Thank you for watching. Keep safe and see you next time.